All right, we started off in our last class period dealing with the whole issue of counseling those who are abused. And we had just gotten into some of the finer points of that, and we ended up having to conclude the class. Let me see if I can just do a quick review for a little bit and maybe catch you up, and then we'll jump right back into our notes like you see on the screen here. Sometimes in our society, we have a problem with using the word abuse. When we say somebody has been abused, one of the problems is oftentimes in society it has a very broad usage. There's a lot of things that are abused. When people disagree with us, I think I used the illustration before, some people think that they're being abused. And I believe I can say this, that I think one of the problems with the word abused is that it has almost a magic negativity. It's negatively charged. And so people begin to say, well, I'm an abuse victim. Or I'm an abuse survivor. Actually, when you look at the 150 Psalms that are there, 30 have to do with personal sins, and over 100 of them deals with issues of injustice, or oftentimes we would say in our society, abuse. What has happened when a person has been abused? Well, one of the biggest factors that have occurred is that there has been a betrayal of trust. There has been an abuse of authority. A person who is in an implicit position of trust has violated that trust. They can be a husband, it can be a wife, it can be a parent, it can be anybody that is in relationship, at least on a peer level, to, or over another person, where there is an implicit, or sometimes it's more explicit, sense of trust. That's what's been abused. And this is what brings about such great pain in abuse situations. It's because that authority figure or peer has misused the trust that we gave them. And so the abuse has marked that person. It's marked them. And I think I used the illustration, you get a little, kind of a micro understanding of what being marked means if you've ever been in a crowded parking lot and set off the alarm on your car. You're marked. Everybody looks like you're the thief. All right? You're a marked person. And the feelings that come over you when that happens. Or, if you've ever been pulled over by a police officer, and there are literally hundreds of people passing you on the car, you feel like you're on the freeway, you feel like you're marked. Well, you have been. Now, sometimes people who have been abused this directly affects them because they have been marked for a long period of time in their life. That's what makes abuse type situations so difficult. It's kind of like the woman who was abused by her father and 5 brothers, and along with their friends, who later, when she grew up and became a mother and was angry with her children because they had disobeyed, yet when she went to punish them, she was paralyzed because she was afraid that she would end up abusing her children, and so her past had marked her to the point that she would flinch and withdraw from punishing them. So And we've got to realize that oftentimes we want things to change in an abuse situation overnight. And I may have mentioned this too, I think, in our first class period. God really works at a pace that is not what we would choose. So our God works in centuries, in millennia, in months, in years. And really, I think we need to remind people who are being abused that it's not the speed of your growth and your change, it's the direction of it that's the important thing. That's the critical issue. It's the direction. And it's interesting to me on how in the world's technique to deal with abuse is, in a sense, to calm the person down, the person who's been abused. They do it with Prozac, they do it with wine, they do it with cognitive behavioral therapy, they do it through vacation or yoga or hypnotism or whatever the case may be. That's kind of the world's approach to dealing with this particular problem. But for us as Christians, what we've got to do is we've got to help them be fearless. We have to teach them to be courageous. That's critical. And I'm going to talk about that a little more. Being wise in defining love to them. Now, we laid out last week the marital matrix of the home. And we talked about the husband and the wife, and we talked about the Christian and the unbeliever. And there are a variety of different scenarios that could come up as a result of that in counseling abuse situations. So, and we had talked about some of those scenarios. The first question we ask, who is the Christian? And then the second question we ask, who is the abuser? And in the first scenario that we worked on was the Christian husband, Christian wife, and we talked a little bit about the husband being the abuser. And then we talked about sometimes it's different. It's the wife who is the abuser, or it could be both, incidentally, as well. And then we had just gotten to the point where we were talking about the abuser in the mixed home, number 2. And the first scenario we come up with is the Christian husband, unbelieving wife, and you've got an abusive husband. This is where the Christian husband is abusing his unbelieving wife. Now, this is a tragic type of a situation. And it's also, we would say, a rare situation. Not because it doesn't exist. No, it does. But for you as a pastoral counselor, or for any biblical counselor, you're seldom going to have the opportunity to work with this situation because husbands are often reluctant to come for counseling. And the unbelieving wife is usually not going to come to you for counseling. She's probably going to involve anybody. She's going to involve secular counselors or civil authorities before you even have a chance to work with the husband. But let's say, for instance, the Christian husband is willing to come to you. He realizes that he has a problem with anger, and he realizes he has a problem with violent behavior and abuse. Then you've got to teach him how to handle his anger and teach him to live out 1 Peter 3:7. And we're going to come back to 1 Peter 3:7 and talk about that a little bit later. But he's got to learn to treat her with respect, even though she's not a Christian, and treat her as an heir of the gracious gift of life, even though she's not. One of the key words in that verse is the English word as an heir of the grace of life. It's key there, because she's not. Yes?
You made a comment passing about the authorities. She might report them.
Yes.
I understand with children and abuse, that's a kind of a sticky situation. Is that the same, even as the laws on the books, does that make it even difficult? Or ideas maybe we should know about between spouse?
Yeah.
Like what's the...
It's a good question. And let me repeat it here. The question really comes... the laws of the land. having to do, especially here in America. The laws in most states are pretty restrictive, and in talking about counselors as defining them as being responsible to report any kind of child abuse that's going on. The question is that true of abuse that occurs with a spouse? All right? It is not. It does not have to be reported, to my knowledge. Now, I'm not familiar as much with laws in other countries, but in this particular case, it's my knowledge, unless, of course, you are aware that there is some imminent danger to someone, and you just generally have a civic responsibility to report that, so that it doesn't result in somebody's death. And more often than not, as a pastoral counselor, you do run somewhat of a risk in reporting some things to civil authorities, because basically secular people with secular minds are going to take over, and they're not going to handle things in a biblical way. But we also have to remember Romans 13 and 1 Peter 2 that talks about the fact that God gave those secular authorities for a purpose, so that there's not general chaos in society. So we still have to respect them, obey all of the laws of the land, as long as it doesn't contradict directly a law, a command of Scripture. And then beyond that, it's up to our conscience on what needs to be reported and what doesn't need to be reported. But you bring up a good issue. In fact, one of the things that we're going to end up concluding with is some of those kind of guidelines. We're going to talk about that. So here we're talking about Christian husband, unbelieving wife, and an abusive husband. So, obviously, then 1 Peter 3:7, Colossians 3:19. In fact, take your Bible and just go over there real quickly, because I think this is an excellent passage to illustrate what we. There Paul says, "Husband, love your wives and do not be embittered against them." Now, the way that this is constructed in the original language, you don't quite see it as readily in the English, but in the original language, the implication is that if you're properly loving your wife in a self-giving way, it's going to be hard, if not impossible, to be bitter against them. All right? And that's where the lack is. In a sense, that's what the put on is for this kind of a husband. He needs to properly love his wife in a self-giving way in every aspect of his life. And that will guard his heart from becoming bitter. And some of that bitterness is the source of his anger and violent behavior. You know, I've had husbands say to me, "Yes, but you don't know this woman. I mean, she has a wicked tongue. She can slice you and dice you with her tongue. And I've lived with this for years, and you don't understand how provocative that is, da-da-da-da-da-da-da." And maybe that's true. Generally, you could probably say women are usually better with their tongues than men are. Men, in dealing with situations, rather than using their tongues, start using their fists, all right, in general situations. But that's true, but if he is practicing, according to Colossians 3:19, self-sacrificial love in her direction, as defined by John 13, where Jesus washes the disciples' feet, even the feet of Judas, who was to betray him, and this is one of the things that I emphasize. In other words, he treated Judas with the same amount of care as he did the rest of the disciples, so much so that there in John 13, he says, "One of you is going to betray me," and the disciples look at each other as if they don't have a clue as to who it is, because Jesus treated them all equally. All right? So he treated the one who was going to betray him with the same amount of care as he treated the ones who were going to give their life for him. Same amount of care. So if you're practicing the selfless love that Christ talks about, there in John 13:35, "New commandment I give unto you, that you love one another, even as I have loved you, you love one another." It's not a new commandment to love one another, because that's in the Old Testament. But Jesus brought newness to the new commandment in the sense that, as I have loved you, you're not just going to love your friends, you're going to love those who are your enemies. In this particular case, it was Judas. And by the way, he made that statement right after Judas left. So if you can get a husband practicing that kind of self-sacrificial love towards his wife, his heart will not be embittered against her. And so it's not going to provoke the wrath and the anger that would be there. And then, of course, then you can see the last principle here on the screen. Then if he is unwilling to change, then formal church discipline becomes the key for him. Because obviously if he's a part of your church, he's a serious Christian. If he's a serious Christian, he's going to be a part of your church. Then it's church discipline that brings teeth to counseling. And you can really turn up the pressure through church discipline. All right, the next scenario then is a scenario of the Christian husband unbelieving wife, and the wife is the one who is the abusive one. Now, I've had cases like this before. You've got a Christian husband, unbelieving wife, husbands whose wives are not believers, and these wives are very violent. There's been times where these husbands were fearful for their lives. In one case that I had, the wife didn't become violent until her husband trusted Christ as his Lord and Savior. They had a great relationship. In fact, that's her statement. They had a great relationship until you got involved with this Jesus stuff. All right, as soon as you got involved in this Jesus stuff, it just ruined everything. And if actually he was treating her better now that he was a Christian than when he was an unbeliever, but it was the very fact that he loved Christ, she didn't, that she interpreted that changed the dynamic of the relationship. She realizes she has a different husband in her life and that she has no desire to follow Christ, so it makes her extremely angry that he's become a quote-unquote Jesus freak, is what she would say quite frequently. I remember one particular case. In fact, I am still good friends with this man. I counseled him for several weeks. He had an unbelieving wife, and his wife is still an unbeliever today. But she was a social worker, practicing a lot of pagan psychology. In fact, she ran these therapy sessions with groups of women who were unhappy in their marriages. And you can only guess what happens in those therapy sessions. I mean, these therapy sessions become bash your husband sessions. All right? So the hours go by and they're just throwing these angry, hateful things out. And then when they get done, it's almost like it's a cathartic experience. Then they kind of, oh, we all feel so much better and we go home. Well, you can imagine leading groups like that week after week, month after month, year after year, and what kind of toll that's going to have on your thinking. Well, it did on hers. And increasingly, she became more and more hostile to her husband. One day, or one night, he was sound asleep in bed. He told me he woke up and she was on top of him, pounding him with her fists. And he had a bloody nose from it. And he looked up to her and he says, "What are you doing?" And she looked at him and she pointed her finger right in his nose. She says, "Someday you're going to wake up with a butcher knife in the middle of your chest." And I'm going to change his name because this is still an ongoing scenario. But I said to him, "Tom, what are you going to do? Do you still want to live with this woman, even though she could possibly become so angry that she murders you?" And you know what his response to me was? He says, "Oh." And back then, I was still pastoring. He called me Pastor John. He says, "Pastor John," he says, "even if it costs me my life, I want to try to lead her to Christ." Well, I'm not going to hinder that guy. I'm going to try to do everything I can to support him. All right? And later on, he told me a story. I went back to my home church to visit about a year ago. They had their 20th anniversary. And since I was the founding pastor of the church, they asked me to come back and speak. Had a great time. And I saw him, and I said to him, "Tom, how's it going?" And he said, "Well," he says, she still hasn't come to Christ yet, but interesting thing happened. And I said, well, what's that? She says, well, her father was dying. And she came to me and she said, I want you to go to the hospital and I want you to share the gospel with my father. And he was just amazed by this. And he said, oh, sure. He says, why don't you come with me? And she's, no, I don't want to go with you, but I want you to go. All right. So he went to the hospital and shared the gospel with her father. And he just beamed. I mean, he was just the proudest husband in the world. He thought that was the greatest thing, that God was so working in her heart that he would have an opportunity to share the gospel with her father. That was just remarkable. So, do these cases occur? Yeah, they do. They occur. This violent, unbelieving wives really are on the increase. The more you see feminism become a part of the culture, you're going to see more and more of this. It's made some women very, very angry, unhappy. And often these women have had some type of therapeutic input through books or counseling or assertiveness training groups where they're trained to assert themselves and demand their rights, make sure their rights are up there. Yes.
So what, if you were to have a situation, say with we'll use an example, a believing wife and an unbelieving husband, and the unbelieving husband is abusing her, at what point, and what do we use scripturally to make allowances for her safety?
Okay. You're getting way ahead of me. Okay? It's a good question, but I knew that was going to come. All right, and the essential question is, if you have an unbelieving husband and a believing wife, what provisions scripturally do we make for her safety? Just hang in there. We will hopefully sufficiently try to answer that for you. All right, so their husband's faith only serves to magnify their anger, we would say. Counseling the husband should focus on 1 Peter 3:7. Matthew 5:43 through 48, which deals with loving your enemies. You have heard that it was said, love your friends and hate your enemies. But I say unto you, Jesus said, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. And that way you will be acting as true sons of your Father in heaven. Luke 6, very similar admonition. And Romans 12, overcoming evil with goodness. Overcoming evil with goodness. Training him how to do that. Where she, oftentimes in a situation like this, what an unbelieving wife will do is she'll find every way she can to torment him. And he's got to make sure that he's living as uprightly and righteously and as caringly as he can with her. There's no room, there's no wiggle room for mistakes here. In a normal marriage, there's enough love to go around where there's wiggle room for mistakes. There's no wiggle room for mistakes. He's got to live on top of things all the time. Otherwise, she'll use it against him. Yes.
Along those lines, then, would now be a time where you might be able to comment on the 1 Corinthians 7:14, with the unbelieving husband being sanctified through his wife and the unbelieving wife being sanctified?
Yeah.
Through a believing husband.
Well, in that particular case, sanctified in the sense that some of the New Testament Christians, it's my understanding of the context of 1 Corinthians 7, some of those New Testament Christians were seeking to get out of their marriages because of, well, let's go over there real quickly. I don't want to get sidetracked too much, but 1 Corinthians 7:14 is the question that came up. You'll notice the context of the whole thing is verse 26. He says, I think then that it is good in view of the present distress, that it is good for a man to remain as he is. This is where many believe these are the early days of the Herodian persecution. A lot of distress is coming on, very similar to the context of 1 Peter. And with that in mind, there are some believers who are saying, listen, my husband or wife are not Christians, so that means that I don't have to live with them. They're unholy people. No. They need to continue to live with them, and that's the idea behind being sanctified. Verse 14 says, for the unbelieving husband is sanctified through his wife, and the unbelieving wife is sanctified through her believing husband. Now, sanctified can mean made holy, but I think the idea is the idea of sanctification has to do with not holiness in a sin sense, as much as it is this particular person is pure. It's pure and honorable to live with this person. Okay? For otherwise your children are unclean, he says, but now they are holy. In other words, the idea is that you continue to live with the unbelieving spouse. That's what you do. That's the way with this Christian husband and the unbelieving wife as well. Now, at the core of this is a lot of anger and bitterness. We'll talk about that real soon, about anger, here in our course. So as a result of that, she becomes very demanding. She becomes hateful she vindictive in what she does. And by the way, in this, she can sexually tease her husband a lot. This is a very common thing. Obviously, he's attracted to her. She knows it. So she'll wear provocative things and sexually tease him and then refuse to fulfill him. And that becomes a vindictive process with her. Or violent. She becomes very, very violent. Or very verbal, caustic, with her words and her patterns of words. So all of those things come out of a heart that's angry and bitter, often just over the sheer fact that he's a Christian. She realizes that has brought a division in their marriage. Their lives now are headed in two different directions. She serves herself, and in reality Satan. He serves the Lord and others. This is the Christian husband, unbelieving wife. All right. Then there is the unbelieving husband and the Christian wife, and you've got an abusive husband. Now this is a far more common scenario. An angry, unbelieving, oftentimes drunk husband is taking out his frustrations on his Christian wife and sometimes even the children. The very fact that she is a Christian, as in the other scenario, is enough to ignite his fuse against her. This is a very common counseling scenario for you to encounter. And oftentimes you'll find yourself dealing with this over and over again. Again, the very fact that she is a believer is often sufficient to incite his anger. At this particular point, this woman needs to know the protection of God, the church, as well as civil authorities. There's 3 safety nets that are here that are really critical. And she especially needs internal fortification that teaches God's protection, faithfulness, and peace. And what I'm going to do, we're going to discuss in a little bit how to help this woman in much more detail. But for now, like the Christian husband in the previous scenario, this woman is at war, and you've got it, spiritual warfare. I'm not talking about physical. She's at war spiritually, and you've got to teach her to be a good soldier for Christ's sake in this particular war. That's important. You've got to teach her to be a good soldier. This is the kind of thing that will break your heart, because oftentimes her husband is bigger, stronger. There's a greater threat on her life. It's not as if women won't take men's lives. They certainly do, and they certainly have in the past, and they will. But in this particular case, if he's a very volatile person, and he becomes real physical, he may actually do things that he doesn't really intend to do. It may deform her or take her life. So it's a pretty serious situation. I counseled a woman back several years ago. It must have been about 17 years ago, around 1990. She was a Christian woman married to a Muslim Lebanese man. who he had returned to Lebanon and wanted her to join him. And at that particular time, it was my understanding that a husband had absolute right and authority over her life, including taking her life if he so willed. He had to provide some kind of justification, but essentially he could end her life if he believed that she was not the right kind of wife. That's a tough scenario to counsel. This is not an uncommon thing, and it will present you with a lot of very difficult situations. Now, occasionally, again, this is a rare one, but an unbelieving husband, Christian wife with an abusive wife. Okay? Abusive wife. A rare situation, not because it doesn't exist, it does, but most unbelieving husbands are not going to be put up with violence very long. Either they're going to return the violence themselves, they're going to get real physical with her. Or they'll turn her over to civil authorities and she'll be hauled away to jail. And now, here in the United States, I know this is not true in all countries, but any spouse, husband or wife, it can be demonstrated in some way that they have been physically abusive to their spouse, immediately they go to jail. That's in most states. They don't even ask questions. They just take them away. Just on the mere sheer accusation and the view of any kind of bruises. If she's willing to receive biblical counsel, then there's going to be hope here for real change. But you've got to teach her how to handle her anger God's way and how to live out 1 Peter 3, 1 through 6. I mean, she's got to understand that thoroughly from beginning to end, every day. She's got to learn to treat him with respect and submission, even though he's not a Christian. In other words, his rejection of her Savior does not give her an excuse not to be a godly or submissive wife with her husband. In fact, she can help win him over to righteousness if she practices godly submission. This is exactly what Proverbs 11:16 says. A kind-hearted woman gains respect. Or a gracious woman attains honor, the New American Standard says. She can be gracious and in order to bring honor. And then, of course, if she refuses to stop her violent behavior towards her husband, then obviously, like the other Christian husband, you have an opportunity here to focus in on church discipline. That becomes, again, a way to deal with this problem. Yes?
I realize my illustration I'm going to share isn't as great as this, but it is something kind of in that vein. And that is this lady typically attends a charismatic church, and I know the husband, but her reaction to him is to really treat him down, just kind of talk down to him all the time. You can kind of pick that up. That kind of an attitude that, well, he's not a Christian, so I don't respect him. And I don't suspect any of this going on, but can you just kind of go into that a little bit? What would your approach be with something like that? I imagine that's real typical in those circles.
All right, let me see if I understand this right. This is a lady that attends a charismatic church. She evidences a lack of respect for her husband by the way that she talks down to him.
Yeah, because he's not yet.
All right. And you suspect that she is also violent with him.
Maybe not violent, but it hasn't escalated to that. But I look at that kind of similar in that although she's not violent, it's not that it wouldn't lead to that, I guess. But how do you attack that biblically?
Okay. Well, usually people that are like that, both men and women coming out of that kind of church environment, pride themselves in their spiritual walk and spirituality. And I would take her over probably to passages like James 3 that deals with the tongue, all right, and the control of the tongue and how wicked the tongue may be, all right, and that the source of that, if you go over to James 3 just for a moment, the source of that really comes from what James talks about this in verse 11. He says, does a fountain send out from the same opening both fresh and bitter water? Well, the obvious answer is no, it doesn't. It has to do with the very character of that fountain or spring. Can a fig tree, my brethren, produce olives, or a vine produce figs? Well, the answer is no. Neither can salt water produce fresh water. Now, what is he saying? He's saying that all this tongue issue is a heart issue. And people who use their tongue this way are revealing a wicked heart. And then he talks about wisdom, which is vitally connected to the heart. In verse 13, he says, who among you is wise and understanding? Let him show by his good behavior his deeds and gentleness of wisdom. That's how he shows it. And in her case, her good behavior would be how she refers to her husband and respects the God-appointed authority in her life. But if you have bitterness and jealousy and selfish ambition in your heart, do not be arrogant, and so do not lie against the truth. This wisdom is not that which comes down from above, but is earthly, natural, and look at this, demonic. That'll speak to her as a charismatic. For where jealousy and selfish ambition exist, there is disorder in every evil thing. But the wisdom that is from above is first pure. This is all within context of the tongue and use of the tongue. Peaceable, gentle, reasonable, full of mercy, good fruits, unwavering, without hypocrisy. And the seed whose fruit is righteousness is sown in peace by those who make peace. And then there shouldn't be any chapter division here. What is the source, he says, of your quarrels and conflicts among you? Is not your source your pleasures that wage war in your members? You lust, you do not have, you commit murder. I don't think he really is saying that they're going around murdering each other, but in the sense that Jesus used it there in the Sermon on the Mount, they hated, and a heart of a hater and a heart of a murderer is the same thing. They're committing murder in their heart, because that's the whole focus here is the heart. And you are envious and cannot obtain, so you fight and you quarrel, you do not have because you do not ask. You don't ask God because you ask with wrong motives. Now, so the issue here is that her heart needs to radically change. I would really challenge her. So by starting early in James 3, dealing with her tongue and the wickedness of it, and then gradually working down into her heart and showing her what's really causing all of the fights and quarrels and her anger and her outbursts has to do with what James calls earthly, natural, demonic, evil things that are part of her heart. That's going to be key. All right. If she's a genuine Christian, she's not demon-possessed, but she's acting demonic when she's that way. So hopefully something like that would help to wake her up. Okay. Next scenario then has to do with the abuser and the unbelieving home. You have the unbelieving husband and unbelieving wife. All right. And sometimes you're called upon to seek some kind of resolution or address this in a home like this, where you have an abusive husband. This is the most common abuse situation. That is, a husband in a secular home abusing his wife. That's the most common thing out there. That probably is 95%, well, maybe that's a stretch. 90% of all the abuse that goes on out there, that's it right there. That's the most common thing. But counseling is futile here. Evangelism is important. Again, all counseling is pre-counseling until that person comes to Christ. Now, that doesn't mean that I won't spend a few sessions with people to help to show them that the Bible has some answers to their problems. But ultimately, I will remind them that at best, all they can do is change their behavior. They can't change their heart. Only God can do that. You're just putting Band-Aids on cancer. You're just rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic. They're eventually going to hell. Okay? And that's their big problem that's going on here. So the Bible doesn't say that you can counsel unbelievers. The Bible says we're supposed to evangelize unbelievers. Why? Well, because we're operating with two different authorities, right? I mean, the unbeliever authority is themselves, or what other men have said, and our authority, we live under the Word of God. That's our authority. And so that's two different authorities we're appealing to. We're not serving the same law, so to speak. So that's the reason why evangelism is going to be important here. If we have an abusive wife in this particular situation, this is becoming more and more common. There's no hope for heart level change until trust is actually placed in Jesus Christ as Lord and Savior. Now, secular and integrational counseling approaches to the issue like this of marital abuse acts as if this is an unusual or abnormal phenomena. But if you really understand theology and take theology seriously, your question is not, why is there so much abuse? That's what the people in the world will throw up their hands and say, why is there so much abuse? No, the question is, why hasn't there been more abuse reported? Because I believe in the non-Christian home there's a considerable amount of verbal and physical abuse that never is reported. Why is that? Well, take your Bible and let's go back to Genesis chapter 3. According to Scripture, this is the natural state of the human condition. After Adam and Eve sinned, God pronounces the curse first upon the serpent and then upon the woman. And he says to the woman, I will greatly multiply your pain in childbirth. That little word in, shouldn't be there. The Hebrew is and. I will greatly multiply your pain and your childbirth. In pain you shall bring forth children. And then it says, and this is interesting, yet your desire shall be for your husband, and he shall rule over you. Now, what does that mean? You know, there have been a lot of commentaries written on this. What is the desire? Well, God gave the woman a sexual desire for her husband. Well, I hardly think that that's a curse. All right. That's supposed to be part of the blessing of marriage, I would think. But if you go over to 4:7, where God is talking to Cain, this is the only other time this particular term is used here in Genesis. It says, God says to Cain, if you do well, will not your countenance be lifted up? If you do not do well, sin is crouching at your door, and its desire, there it is. See that word? Desire. Its desire is for you, but you must master it. Now, what is he saying? He's saying that Cain is at a point where he has to make a decision. Either he's going to follow this path of jealousy against his brother, which is like sin crouching at the door. And if he walks through this doorway, sin is like a wild animal that's going to pounce on him and control him and manipulate him. But if he decides not to go that direction, then and he obeys God, then as part of that obedience, there'll be joy. Your countenance will be lifted up. There's always joy in repentance and obedience. That's what God says. But the word desire here has the idea of sin crouching at the door, desiring to pounce on and capture that person and controlling them. Now, if that's the same idea, which I tend to think that it is, it makes a lot of sense to me back in chapter 3 and verse 16, where it says, your desire shall be for your husband. Eve's desire as a part of the curse was to control and manipulate her husband. Eve wants to control. And he shall rule over you. Hebrew word there is molach, which has to do with, it can mean to act like a despot. All right? So her desire will be to control him. His desire will be to rule over her like a despot. And in every marriage, there is that desire. All right? Sometimes you've ever heard the statement, women marry men hoping they'll change. That's that control thing. And men marry women hoping they won't. And they both get disappointed. All right? So the women end up changing, and the men don't end up changing. See? And they both get disappointed. That's the idea. In every marriage, there is the manifestation of the curse. Her desire to control her husband, make him turn out the way she wants him to be. And his desire will be then to rule over her with an iron fist. So now marriage becomes a game of King of the Hill. Okay? It becomes the battleground of the sexes. That becomes and so there's constant strife. So the question here is not, why is there so much abuse? Actually, from a theological standpoint, the real question is, why don't we hear about more of it? Because there's probably a lot more going on out there than we really know of in homes. My wife and I first moved here to California. Before we bought our home, we lived temporarily in a condo section of town. And in the summertime, when our windows were wide open, we could hear people, these condos are really crunched together, and you can hear everybody, all the conversations they're having in their condos nearby. And we would sit there at the dinner table, and sometimes we would just be shocked at the anger, the hate, the quarreling that went on in different relationships and condos all around us. I mean, we were stunned. And I think there's a lot more of that happens out there in the world than ever comes to the level of ever being reported. It's just wicked stuff. That's a picture of the unbelieving home. And to some degree, even every Christian home will manifest that curse. It's just that, isn't it great that Jesus Christ comes along and takes the sting of that curse away? And now gives him a willingness to be a servant leader in his home, and her a willingness to humbly submit herself to his leadership in the home when the sting of that curse now is taken away. Wow. But it's not as if the Christian home doesn't manifest some of the strife. Because the natural home under the curse is at odds with each other. That's the natural home. So, when it says there in 3:16, your desire, her desire then will be to control. She'll wish to manipulate, like sin's desire to control and run the life of Cain. The wife's desire would be the same for her husband, and he will rule, dominate, be a despot. The husband's desire would be to rule and dominate his wife like a tyrant, to keep her under his thumb. So marriage under the curse becomes a game of King of the Mountain. And marriage without Christ is a struggle for control. That's what it is. And in a lot of secular and Christian counseling, Christian pop psychological counseling and Christian psychologists, they'll train a wife or a husband, mostly it's wives, assertiveness training. Well, when you add to what the Bible says about the strife between the husband and wife, you add assertiveness training to this. This is like adding gasoline to a smoldering fire. I mean, she goes back in there and starts demanding her rights through assertiveness training. Now, whoosh, this thing is now elevated to a brand new level. And I've seen that happen before. It's interesting how in the secular abuse literature, how often they talk about the control factor. An abused woman, they tell us, must regain control of her life, control of her home, control of her children, control over her finances. That's what she's got to gain control over. Yes?
Yeah, we have I'm a junior high pastor at our church, and I have a lady, and she had a first marriage where she was dominated upon I guess, in an unbiblical way. He wasn't a believer or anything.
Yeah.
Just really felt that, and then ended up, I think he left, and she remarried, and she remarried an unbeliever. It's questionable about her. She professes belief, but it's questionable to me. And so now she knows that she needs to submit to him and desires to do that, but also has made this kind of promise with herself that she would never let that happen to her again, what happened to her the first time. And so, man, she just struggles. And she is a domineering woman and to her husband and to her son. And it's
very condescending. And she's going to keep him in his place. So she's read some books or received some kind of therapy to try to deal with that.
And yet, like I said, she's been coming to church, and she knows what the scriptures say about, like I said, submission, and she knows that side of it needs to be a part of her life, and she wants to submit, but can't let herself, and he won't lead because he's not a believer, and so then she's still dealing with the past thing of wanting to, not be oh man.
Yeah. Well, she's making mistakes all along. I mean, obviously, by marrying an unbeliever is another major mistake here, a sinful. We're only supposed to marry in the Lord. 1 Corinthians 7 is clear about that. So part of this is some of the consequences, and then she has to revert to the world's method of dealing with the consequences of her own sin. So when the secular abuse literature talks about a woman regaining control, translated that means she's got to take control of the home and the kids and the finances, etc. And she remains in the home. And if she remains in the home, then that counsel is going to cause all kind of strife to escalate, which results in either divorce or death by one of them. And obviously, in the middle of all this, Christ is the only answer, right? To the non-Christian marriage. If they refuse to trust Christ, then they refer them, then the only thing you can do is refer them to civil authorities. Just as Galatians 6:10 says, therefore, as we have opportunity, let us do good to all people, especially to those who are the family of believers. So, there's all the different scenarios. Now, let's get into more practical counseling issues, where we're dealing with the whole issue of the distress. And the first thing we have to ask the question is, what are the psychologists and integrationists saying is the goal? And we'll deal with that after about a 10-minute break here, okay? As we start this particular section on distress and the goal, of counseling people who are in abusive situations or who are abusers. It's interesting the way the world deals with this. There was a study that came out not long ago, reported by the Associated Press out of Washington, D.C., and it said that some men who are abused as children become violent criminals as adults, while others do not. A new study suggests the difference between the two groups may be a gene that makes a chemical in the brain. The study, which followed the lives of 442 males in New Zealand for 26 years, found these men who had a combination of abuse and flawed brain chemical gene were far more likely to commit criminal and antisocial actions as adults than others in the group. Experts say the findings appearing this week in the Journal of Science could lead to some ways of helping abused children become responsible, non-abusing adults. The men in the study group were tested for activity of a gene called monoamine oxidase A, or MAOA, that produces an enzyme that controls chemicals in the brain which transmit signals between neurons. Among those studies, 279 were found to have normally active MAOA genes, while 163 showed a low level of action from the gene. So the study found that 64% of the men were not abused in childhood, while the balance experienced either severe or probable maltreatment, defined as a rejection by the mother, frequent changes in the primary caregivers, and physical or sexual abuse. At the conclusion of the researchers found that the abused children with low MAOA gene activity, which were 12% of this study, accounted for 44% of the violent crime convictions among all those in the group, said Terry Moffat, a University of Wisconsin-Madison psychologist and co-author of the study. As adults, 85% of the severely maltreated children who also had the gene for low MAOA activity developed antisocial outcomes, such as violent criminal behavior, Moffat said in a statement. So the abused children with normal MAOA genes were no more likely to be antisocial than those who were not abused, the study found. Then he goes on and says, the findings provide evidence that genotypes, genetic characteristics, can moderate children's sensitivity to environmental insults, such as abuse, Moffat said in an email. These findings may partly explain why not all victims of maltreatment grow up to victimize others. Actually, Terry Moffat is a she. She said the findings also suggest a new tool for evaluating the risk that a person may become a problem for society. The combination of the low activity, MAOA genotype, and maltreatment predicts antisocial behaviors about as well as high cholesterol predicts heart disease, said Moffat. This is the way the world is addressing it. So they're going to want to increasingly define the reasons why abuse is occurring, not from obviously a spiritual or given any kind of a theological significance at all, but it has to do with biochemical makeup. So I could eventually see somebody using this kind of study to beat up their husband or their wife or their children and say, hey, listen, it's not my fault. It's this chemical that's in my brain. I just got it as a result of my genetic hardwiring. It's been passed down to me. Yes?
Well, two things. First of all, that study is obviously flawed. They did it from New Zealand, right, Andy?
Yeah. It's flawed because it's people of New Zealand? Is that the idea? Andy's a very gracious guy, all right?
I've talked with some people who, Alcoholics Anonymous, and that's exactly what they teach them, is that it's not, yes. Even now, whether the study has been done on alcoholism or not, I don't know, but that's exactly what they're teaching them, and they're already convinced it's not their fault.
Yeah.
And that's all I'm saying.
Now, I've got a couple other things up here. It's kind of interesting. After we go on through the section that we just went through, here's an article, Women Batter Men Too. And nobody is blame-free in the battle of the genders, which I think is probably a pretty good article that illustrates exactly what Genesis 3:16 is talking about. Like this article says, let me just read a couple sections of it. Like most things these days, domestic violence has become a gender battle of he said, she said variety, or more aptly, she hit me first. Judging from media reports and internet web pages, men and women are plummeting each other at an astounding rate, pummeling each other, I should say, as billboards of bruised women scar urban landscapes. Battered men are venting their spleen on the information highway. Clearly, we have a problem, though it's hard to figure out exactly what it is. Are men battering women more than ever, or are we just more aware? Are women beating up on their husbands just as often as many men claim? Are feminists fudging the truth about gender equality and partner violence to protect coveted funding? The answer seems to depend on who has the biggest statistic. Men prefer a 1988 study in which the researchers found that men and women slap, shove, kick at nearly equal rates. The study, conducted by Murray Strauss, a sociologist and co-director of the Family Research Laboratory at the University of New Hampshire, found that 1,000 couples, 124 wives, attacked husbands and 122 husbands attacked wives. The rate of minor assaults by wives was 78 per 1,000. The rate of similar assaults by husbands was 72 per 1,000. In the category severe assaults, those resulting in serious injury, the rate was 46 per 1,000 by wives and 50 per 1,000 by husbands. Any way you cut it, that's a lot of misbehaving on both sides of the sandbox. That's interesting. And here's another article here that says women are aggressors in domestic disputes as often as men. So here's another issue here. Is that true? I think it does serve to point out the fact that women and men abuse their spouses. If the anger is sufficient, that's what they do. All right, so the question that we started with earlier was, what are the psychologists and integration saying is the goal of abuse-type counseling? Now, understand, I'm not questioning the motives of people who work with abuse victims, whether they're, excuse me, got a terrible case of hiccups here, whether they are Christian or non-Christian. I believe that most of them genuinely have a real concern for the abused. But I am questioning the counsel that is given. If we're biblical Christians, we must trace or trust the Bible over man's thinking, even on the sensitive topic of abuse. Now, in looking at a lot of the literature that's there, this is something that I hope to faithfully relate to you here. But after reading a lot of this literature, I believe it's safe to say that the primary goal that they take to this is to stop the hurt. That's the primary goal. The question is how? How do they do that? How do they stop the hurt? Well, one of the most common ways in the counsel that's given is they teach assertiveness rights. They teach assertiveness rights. You can see this, for instance, in Frank Minerath and Paul Meyer and Stephen Otterburn's illustrate this in Christian integrationalist approach to abuse. They write, in situations involving abuse, those who are victimized must step out of the victim role by removing yourself from the house and from the victim role. You confront your mate's behavior and put your mate on notice that you are no longer accepting that behavior. If there is to be any chance of restoring the marriage, you must convey to your mate, preferably through a third party such as a counselor, that the marriage hinges on your mate's willingness to undergo intensive counseling for his violent tendencies. It should be a long time, and then they put in parentheses, if ever, before any attempt at reconciliation should be made. There should be considerable evidence that the abuser has gotten his behavior under control. The abuser should be in an ongoing accountability group, such as, they say, a 12-step group for rageaholics for many years to come. End of quote. Well,
what was that from again?
That is taken out of the Complete Life Encyclopedia by Minerath, Meyer, and Otterburn. It's published by Nelson Publishers. Page 13. It deals with abuse. Now, if you take this to be the case, if you teach assertiveness training or teach tough love principles, you end up really creating more problems in the marriage. An assertive person becomes offensive. An assertive person becomes demanding, which in turn brings out the worst in other people. And the assertiveness is basically built upon the critical idea that you've got to look out for self at all costs. That's the critical idea. Now you think about that theologically. I have to look out for myself at all costs. Assertiveness is just the exact opposite of what Jesus talked about in Matthew 5:5. When he talks about the fact, blessed are the meek. And you'll notice what he says about the meek. For they shall inherit the earth. So assertiveness training actually goes against kingdom principles. The way that you achieve that which is right. Now, I don't question the motives of people who are counseling this. You understand me. I think that they want justice in this situation. They want a peaceable relationship. But how they're going about it, I believe, ultimately is counterproductive to relationships. It doesn't end in reconciliation. But it does end in wrecks. And Jesus says, the meek will inherit the earth, not the violent or the assertive. Well, the second way is that they teach principles of tough love. And this approach basically says, if you really love your husband, you'll draw boundaries around yourself, you'll make threats, and then you'll follow through with retaliation if those boundaries are breached. You'll make sure your rights are protected at all costs. That's exactly what tough love says. And I think it was Cloud and Townsend that published those series of books on boundaries, which is basically what this is all about. And sold them. I was just in Australia just a few weeks ago, and I was in a Christian bookstore in Australia, and there was a whole set of books on all these boundaries stuff. Obviously, I naturally gravitate to counseling sessions to see what's going on in Christian churches around the world. When you think about this in relationship to how the Bible describes tough love, it is the exact opposite of what Christ modeled. And we're going to see this in 1 Peter 2 in a little bit. Counselors who teach women this type of returning threat for threat are throwing gasoline already on a smoldering fire. No wonder this approach ends in either divorce or death as well. Studies are now coming out to support what biblical counselors have said for years, that abusive men do not beat and rape women because they think poorly of themselves, or because they have been depressed for a long time, and they really look down upon themselves as a result of that. That's absolutely false. And yet when you hear the psychologists and even Christian psychologists talk, that's their view of the problem. Professors from Case Western Reserve University and the University of Virginia studied dozens of people with violent behavior towards others, and they said that violent behavior is associated with high self-esteem, not low self-esteem. Quoting them, they said, people turn aggressive when they receive feedback that contradicts their favorable views of themselves. More to the point, it's mainly the people who refuse to lower their self-appraisals who become violent. A teen who doesn't receive the favorable respect he thinks he deserves will strike out at another. Cases that involve murder, rape, domestic abuse, and even terrorism indicated that violent people have high opinions of themselves. One study of more than 100 rapists showed that the rapist chose a particular victim in order to, quote, disabuse her of her sense of superiority. That is, the woman gave the man the impression that she thought that the woman gave the man the impression that she thought she was better than he was, and so he raped her as a way of proving her wrong. Good examples of this comes from Nazis in terms of white superiority. Ku Klux Klan, again, white superiority, that justified violence on those that they considered to be less favorable to them. So the authors of this study go on to suggest that efforts to increase self-esteem may actually be making the problem of abuse and violence worse. Teaching children higher self-esteem in schools, they say, may actually be compounding the problem of abuse or violence in the next generation. And you know what we should say as Christians? Duh. Abuse counseling that teaches a woman to make threats, retaliate, draw boundaries, be aggressively assertive is foolishness by biblical standards. How do we know this? Let's look at a couple of passages here. Let's go to Proverbs chapter 11. Go to Proverbs 11. And verse 16. Proverbs 11:16. A gracious woman attains honor, and violent men attain riches. Honor is to be preferred over riches. Chapter 10, verse 19, Proverbs. When there are many words, transgression is unavoidable, but he who restrains his lips is wise. That's the opposite of assertiveness training, right? Assertiveness training then would be equivalent to foolishness. Proverbs chapter 15 and verse 1. A gentle answer turns away wrath, but harsh words stirs up anger. In other words, interpersonal relationships is like a tennis match. A soft return from a hard serve bring players closer together. Same thing's true here. A gentle response brings two parties closer together. A hard smash with the ball drives them further apart. Or you take a look at Proverbs chapter 25 and verse 15. Proverbs 25:15. That says, by forbearance a ruler may be persuaded, and a soft tongue breaks a bone. In other words, a gentle tongue can be very powerful. Not an assertive, aggressive, demanding tongue that demands its rights. Assertiveness training in tough love psychology has left numerous, I believe, broken marriages and bodies in its wake. Is tough love asserting your rights, or is it suffering for righteousness' sake, the glory of God and the good of others? What is tough love? Furthermore, they teach take control of your life. Taking control usually translates into secretly withdrawing all the money from your banking account, hiding your valuables, taking over the finances, covertly moving out to an undisclosed location. Taking control often involves deception, deceit, stealing, and withholding from your mate anything that you feel that you will need. That's what taking control of your life means. Now, I don't know about you, but as Christians, I think we ought to have problems with that. When we're advocating deception, deceit, and stealing as a way to reassert oneself. If God is going to turn things around for righteousness' sake, He's not going to expect you to lie or cheat and steal in order to do it. What are we suggesting here? Well, the cycle of violence that you often hear about in abuse literature is actually enhanced or actually accelerated through assertiveness training, tough love, taking active control of your life. That's what it usually means. So that's what they attempt to do in terms of trying to stop the hurt. But that's not the only thing. Their goal also is to stop the harm. How? Well, by sometimes escaping to a shelter. Stop the emotional hurt, stop the physical harm. In fact, one literature says on this, a Christian psychologist writes, don't make excuses for staying in a destructive relationship. I can't afford to leave. I'll never make it on my own. I have no place to go. A woman's shelter will take care of your short-term needs and the needs of your children and will put you in touch with services that will enable you to get on your feet and rebuild your life away from the harmful influence of an abusive mate. Now, there are problems with this approach. Let me suggest some of them. These abusive shelters really take control of those women's lives in an aggressive way. Many of them that I am familiar with show graphic films to the women and the children that come to those shelters of severe abuse, literally scaring them to death. And what they end up effectively doing is elevating the fear of man almost to a panic level. And of course, it's designed with that in mind. It's designed so that they will not, they're heavily invested in not seeing that marriage work. They're heavily invested in that. Now, often when the location of a wife or family are kept from a husband, it creates even more anger in the husband. It leads itself to sinful manipulation and often precludes any kind of restoration. Furthermore, these shelters will not keep a woman indefinitely. They can't. So now they're forced to teach her to get a job, which involves leaving the children in a daycare center in order to support herself. Also, most of the counsel given in those shelters are extremely feminist and very anti-marriage, or at least have a very low view of the sanctity of marriage. One woman who runs a shelter in an area where I used to pastor, at a recent abuse seminar in that area, when she talked about this, you could see coming through her seething hatred for men under the surface. And she spoke to the men who were a part of the audience that day in a very condescending way. There is just, probably she had been abused in the past, I don't know, or she had had someone who had abused her, a father or a man who was a husband, I don't know. Or she had just been so indoctrinated by what she was trying to do that it had just brought out a severe hatred in her life. Furthermore, they talk about separate from your spouse. Because of the radical self-protective counsel given, the situation becomes so violent that the counselor is forced to insist upon a separation. Seldom does this ever end in a reunified home. Couples grow apart as they learn to adjust to living separately. Children are often put in a new school and resist going back to a new teacher. Meaning well, but encouraging wrong, parents of the respective spouses see the relief of stress because the separation and they often actually discourage any reuniting with the spouse. Of course, without that, there is not going to be any reconciliation. Then, thirdly, they talk about divorcing the spouse. And the problem here is not that it's not on biblical grounds for divorce. In fact, statistics demonstrate, the University of Washington demonstrated this, that just as many women are killed by divorced husbands or kicked out boyfriends as husbands in the home, or boyfriends. In other words, just as many women die from the men who they've been separated from as those who stay in the home. The statistic doesn't change. The statistic's the same. And of course, I'm not endorsing live-in boyfriends here. I'm just relating what the study indicates, but it doesn't seem statistically to really accomplish its purpose. Then, thirdly, I want to suggest to you that their goal in counseling recognizes no difference between the types of homes. Recognizes no difference between the types of homes. When you study abuse counseling in the world and the things being said by Christian psychologists in both cases, there's no discernment between the Christian home, a mixed home, a non-Christian home. All of them are treated for the most part the same way. No discernment there. But the Bible is much more precise. It recognizes the differences and accounts for these differences by the counsel that's given. Fourthly, their goal in counseling is only the health of the abused. And of course, the problem is that most abuse counseling has one focus: the good or the physical well-being of those being abused. Rarely is there ever any acknowledgement that the abused victim is the key player in reaching and changing the abuser. The thinking is more in line with personal protection and personal rights, as if once the abused is perfectly safe and assured of their rights, everything's going to be okay. Again, I believe that's a very narrow focus. There's much more that's at stake. This type of approach ignores God, it ignores righteousness, it ignores the real good of everyone involved, it ignores the fact that God can actually turn this situation around, even the things that seem hopeless. Yes?
What do you say to someone who, when you share this concept that the abused can reach out, you're sharing in the context the world is going to react against it, what's our ammo with that? I mean, we can say God will do it, but they're going to look at us and just say that much more that we're lunatics.
Yeah, right. And I think there's some point at which, there's no rebuttal to that unless they're willing to agree with the authority of the Word of God in their life. They will continue to say that, and they said that the early Christians. Paul said, I'll be a fool for Christ. That's okay. And in some cases, you have to go through that in order to actually achieve that which is best for your counselees. All right, so what does the Bible say? What does the Bible say is the goal? Now we're getting down to this. You notice what some integrationists, I gave you illustrations from like Minirth, Meyer, and Otterburn, are saying, which I believe is rather the typical attitude. In fact, taken out of the same encyclopedia, Minirth Meyer makes a statement, some religious extremists teach that women are to be submissive to their husbands even to the point of allowing them to be abused. Now, I insert in here the little question. Notice that a religious extremist is one who allows himself or herself to be abused. All right? That's the way they define it, logically. A religious extremist is a person who allows themselves to be abused. That would make Jesus Christ a religious extremist. Okay? Because he allowed himself to be abused. He had all authority at his fingertips, right? If anybody that could have stopped the abuse, he did. He could have. So that makes Jesus Christ a religious extremist. That's dangerous advice. It's really unbiblical advice. They say, in Ephesians 5:22 we read, wives, submit to your own husbands as to the Lord. This is them speaking. But we also read, husbands, love your wives just as Christ also loved the church and gave himself for her. This instruction from the Lord was intended to teach mutual love and respect in normal husband and wife relationships. It's not a universal teaching intended to cover such extreme situations as a husband who repeatedly commits a felony against his wife. What's true, if he's committing a felony, this throws it in a whole different dimension. But as we're going to see a little bit later in 1 Peter, 1 Peter is going to question this. And it's interesting, in all this abuse literature, they judiciously avoid 1 Peter. According to Minirth Meyer, anyone who counsels a wife that it's not wrong to remain with an abusive husband is a religious extremist. So, now I believe we would all define an extremist as having gone way beyond what the Bible teaches. So anyone who gives this type of counseling has gone way beyond what the Bible's teaching. So it's important for us to ask the question, what is it that the Bible really teaches? In fact, it's in Ephesians 5:22 and 25, it speaks directly to wives who not Ephesians 5, excuse me. 1 Peter 2 and 3 end up speaking directly to wives who have abusive husbands And these texts are strangely absent from Minirth-Meier in the discussion on abuse. Now, we do agree with Minirth-Meier that the Bible teaches mutual love and respect for one another in the husband-wife relationship. But we don't agree that the primary goal of the counselee or the counselor working with an abuse situation is to make personal escape and protection the essential object of their counsel. Virtually at this point, there's no difference between integrationalist counselor and the secular counselor. Both have the same goal, that is, ultimately saving the body. Let me suggest to you that if saving the body is the ultimate goal in counseling, to be consistent, we would have to make that the ultimate goal of Christians across the board. So that would mean a lot of our missionaries who are in locations around the world where they are under bodily threat, we're going to have to pull them home and put them in a protective situation. Because husbands, wives, children are under bodily threat. What does that say about Christians in countries like China, where the church is openly abused and physically harmed? Maybe we should do everything we can to pull and smuggle those people out of China. Or in countries, Islamic countries, where Christianity is outlawed, and yet there are Christians there undergoing persecution all the time, some of them dying. If saving the body is the ultimate goal, then those people shouldn't be there. We should take no risks at all, if that's the ultimate goal. What is the goal? Well, I think from a biblical perspective, we can say that the goal in biblical counseling is to be God's kind of person even in the midst of your trial. Biblical counselors know that the overriding goal in godly counsel is to help the person be a man or woman of God even in the midst of their trial. Jesus Christ did not come to help us escape all the hardships of life. In fact, through those hardships, this is where we learn to obey. We learn to remain true. We learn that He has greater purposes. We ultimately learn His faithfulness. We can see this in Psalms 119 and verse 67, where the psalmist says, "Before I was afflicted, I went astray, but now I obey thy word. Thou art good," verse 68 says, "and dost good. Teach me thy statutes." Psalm 119, verses 67, 68. You skip down, and you go down to verse 71, and he says, "It is good for me that I was afflicted, that I may learn your statutes." And then you go down to verse 75. He says, "I know, O Lord, that thy judgments are righteous, and that in faithfulness thou hast afflicted me." So he views the afflictions that's coming on him as not being brought merely by men. He views those afflictions as actually being brought by God. "I know that thy judgments are righteous, and that in faithfulness thou hast afflicted me." And by the way, the word for know in the Hebrew there in verse 75, he says he knows experientially. This is not abstract. This is an experiential knowledge. I know by experience that thy judgments are righteous, and that in faithfulness thou hast afflicted me. We have a tendency to think that God is being unfaithful when we're afflicted. But God is not being unfaithful. So, the goal in biblical counseling is to be God's kind of person even in the midst of your trial.